The first thing that struck me wasn't the sound of his voice, because there wasn't one yet. It was the silence after the door slammed shut, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, the kind that presses against your ears until you're aware of your own breathing, too loud, too fast. And I remember standing there in my brother's living room, key still in my hand, staring at the door they had just walked out of, my brother and his wife, already arguing under their breath as they crossed the yard, convinced they were leaving behind nothing more than a quiet house and a mute child who would sit exactly where they left him, because that's what they believed about their son, that he existed in stillness, in limitation, in a world without words. And I had believed it too, or at least I had accepted it, accepted the labels, the doctor's notes, the resigned sighs my brother let out whenever someone asked if there had been any progress. And I had come over that afternoon for a simple reason, one that felt harmless at the time, to watch their son for an hour while they ran errands, an hour that was supposed to be uneventful, forgettable, an hour that was supposed to pass like all the others. But as soon as the car engine faded into the distance, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, just a subtle tightening in my chest, a sense that the room was listening. And I remember turning around and seeing him on the floor, his back against the couch, legs stretched out, a small plastic truck resting in his hands, his eyes following me in a way that made me pause, because he wasn't just looking at me. He was watching me, studying me, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. And I smiled, because that's what you do. You smile at a child, especially one who has been described to you as fragile, as limited, as unaware. And I said his name softly, testing the air, expecting nothing in return, and as usual, there was no response, no nod, and I told myself it was fine. It was always like this. So I went about my business, set my keys on the counter, checked my phone, glanced at the clock, thinking about the dinner I still had to cook, the emails I hadn't answered, the dull, ordinary problems that filled my life at that point, unaware that all of it was about to feel impossibly small, because as I turned back toward the living room, I noticed something that made my stomach drop just a little. His hands had stopped moving. The truck lay forgotten on the carpet, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed not on me anymore, but on the hallway behind me, the narrow stretch of corridor that led to the bedrooms. And for reasons I couldn't explain, a chill ran up my spine, the kind of instinctive reaction you get when you sense danger without seeing it. And I followed his gaze, half expecting to see nothing, just shadows and closed doors, and that's exactly what I saw. Nothing out of the ordinary, and yet the feeling didn't go away. It deepened, settled somewhere beneath my ribs, and I laughed it off, forcing a lightness into the room, saying something silly about how quiet it was, how it felt like the house was holding its breath. And that's when it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, unmistakably, a sound broke the silence, a single word, spoken in a voice so soft and steady that for a second my brain refused to process it, refused to accept what my ears had just heard, because the word had come from behind me, from the living room, from the child everyone said could not speak. And I froze, my heart slamming so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. And I turned slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast the moment would vanish, that I would discover I had imagined it. But there he was, still sitting on the floor, still watching me, his mouth slightly open, his expression calm, almost solemn. And before I could say anything, before I could even not mispronounced, not slurred, but perfect, as if he had practiced it, as if he had been holding it inside him for years, waiting for the right moment to let it out. And my knees actually weakened. I had to grab the back of a chair to steady myself, because my entire understanding of this child, of this family, of reality itself had just cracked wide open, and I whispered his name in return, my voice trembling, asking if he had just spoken. Ridiculous question, I know, but my mind was scrambling for something familiar, something safe, and he didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the hallway again, that same focused, alert look, and then back at me. And when he spoke this time, his voice was still quiet, but there was an urgency to it that made my skin prickle, And he said something that made the air leave my lungs, something no child his age should have known, something no one should have known except me. And as the words sank in, a wave of unease washed over me, because suddenly this wasn't just about a miracle, it wasn't just about a child finding his voice, it was about a truth I had buried so deeply I had almost convinced myself it didn't matter anymore. A truth about the accident I had survived years ago, the one everyone called bad luck, the one that had left scars I never talked about. And as he spoke, halting but precise, my mind reeled back in time, back to the night of screeching tires and blinding headlights, back to the smell of smoke and the taste of blood, back to the moment I realized someone had been watching me long before that crash, and standing there in my brother's living room, listening to his son speak words he should not have known, I felt the first real flicker of fear I had felt in years, because whatever this child had just unlocked, whatever truth he was pointing toward, it was clear that the danger I thought I had escaped was closer than I ever filled the room again. My instinct screamed at me to listen, to remember, to finally face what I'd been running from, because somehow, impossibly, this child knew, and what he knew had the power to either destroy me or save my life. And in that moment, with the house still silent and the door still closed behind my brother and his wife, I realized that hour I had agreed to watch him was never meant to be ordinary. It was meant to be a warning, and I was just beginning to understand it. I sank down into the nearest chair without meaning to, my legs refusing to hold me anymore, my eyes never leaving his face, because now that the shock had cracked something open inside me, I could see him differently, not as the quiet, unreachable child everyone pitied, but as someone alert, burdened, as if he had been carrying something far too heavy for his small frame. And when I finally found my voice, it came out barely above a whisper, asking him how he knew those things, how he knew about the man in the other car, about the argument earlier that evening, about the way I had felt watched for weeks before the crash. And he didn't answer right away. Instead, he scooted closer, the plastic truck scraping softly across the floor, a mundane sound that somehow made the moment feel even more surreal. And he looked up at me with a seriousness that made my chest ache. Then he said my name again, slower this time, like he wanted to make sure I was really listening. And he told me I had to be quiet now, that I had to listen carefully because they were still nearby, and that single sentence sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, because my brother and his wife were supposed to be gone, supposed to be across town by now. And I glanced toward the front window, half expecting to see their car still parked outside, but the driveway was empty, the street still, and when I told him they had left, that we were alone, he shook his head. They always a small, deliberate move, but sometimes they don't really go far. And that's when the unease twisted into something sharper, something colder, because the way he said it wasn't childish or confused. It was matter of fact, like he was stating a rule of the world I had somehow missed. And I asked him who he meant, who didn't really go far. And his gaze flicked once more toward the hallway, lingering on the closed bedroom door at the end, the one that was always locked, the one no one ever went into anymore. And suddenly the air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and memories I had shoved aside for years began to surface. Memories of my brother's house always feeling slightly off, of arguments that cut off abruptly when I entered the room, of his wife's tight smiles, and careful questions about my schedule, my routines, my drives home. And as these thoughts collided in my mind, the boy spoke again, his words tumbling out a little faster now, as if the dam inside him was finally breaking. And he told me that the night of my accident wasn't an accident at all, that the man who hit me hadn't been drunk, hadn't lost control, that he had been following me, just like the other times. And I felt my stomach drop, because no one had ever mentioned other times, no one had ever suggested a pattern. And yet a sickening clarity settled over me as I remembered the unexplained delays, the strange phone calls that hung up when I answered, the feeling of being watched that I had dismissed as trauma, as paranoia. And I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrests. asking him how he knew this, where he had heard it. And his answer was simple, devastating. He said he heard them talking late at night, when they thought he was asleep, when they thought he didn't understand, because they always talked like he wasn't really there, like he was furniture, like he was empty, and my chest tightened painfully that in underestimating him. They had handed him secrets no child should have known. And I asked him who they were, my voice barely steady. And he said my brother's name, then his mother's, then a third name I hadn't heard in years, a name that made my blood run cold, because it belonged to someone from my past, someone I had trusted once, someone who had disappeared from my life shortly after the crash. And as that name echoed in my head, everything began to align. The financial troubles my brother had hinted at, the sudden improvement after the accident, the way he avoided my eyes whenever the subject came up, and I felt a surge of anger so intense it made my vision blur. Anger at my brother for his silence, at myself for my blindness. And yet beneath it all was a deeper fear, because if this child was right, if the crash had been orchestrated, then the danger wasn't over, it never had been. And as if sensing my spiraling thoughts, the boy reached out and placed his small hand on my arm. A grounding touch that snapped me back to the present. And he told me that's why he spoke today, why he chose today, because something was going to happen, something soon, something worse than before, and my heart pounded as I asked him what he meant, what was going to happen, and his answer came with a calm that terrified me more than panic ever could. He said they were tired of waiting, tired of hoping I would disappear on my own, and that this time they wanted to be sure. And the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as the weight of his words settled over me. And I thought of my brother, of shared childhoods and scraped knees and whispered promises to always protect each other. And the betrayal cut so deep it felt physical. But even his grief threatened to overwhelm me. Another realization pushed through, sharper, clearer. This child had broken his silence to warn me, to save me, and whatever came next, I couldn't ignore it. Since the accident, the truth was staring me in the face, spoken in the soft, steady voice of a boy everyone else believed could not speak at all. And as I looked at him, truly looked at him, I knew this was only the beginning, that the warning he had given me was just the first step in a reckoning that had been years in the making, and I had a terrible feeling that before the day was over, I would have to decide how far I was willing to go to survive it. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deeply, because panic would only make me careless, and carelessness was exactly what had nearly killed me once already. And as I sat there with his small hand still resting on my arm, I realized something else that chilled me even more than his warning. He had planned this moment, chosen it carefully, waited until his parents were gone, waited until there was no one else to hear him speak. Which meant he understood not just what they were doing, but the danger of being overheard. And that level of awareness in a child made my throat tighten. And I asked him why he had never spoken before, why he had stayed silent all these years. And for the first time, his expression faltered, the composure cracking just enough to reveal the fear underneath. And he told me that the first time he tried, really tried, when he was younger, when he had repeated something he heard his parents say, his father had grabbed him hard and told him that if he ever spoke again, something bad would happen to me, that I would get hurt because of him, and my vision swam as the implication hit, because that meant my brother had used me as leverage against his own son, had weaponized my life to enforce silence, and the guilt crashed over me in a suffocating wave. Guilt for every visit where I had smiled politely and left early. Guilt for every time I had assumed the boy's silence was simply what the doctors said it was. Guilt for not seeing the fear against the lump in my throat. I promised him, quietly but firmly, that whatever happened next, I would not let them hurt him or me again. And he nodded like he had been waiting for that promise, like it was the final confirmation he needed. And then he told me we didn't have much time because his parents always checked the house cameras when they traveled, always, and I froze, my eyes darting instinctively toward the corners of the room, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every dark lens I had ignored before, and he pointed them out one by one. The small black dome near the ceiling, the one disguised as a smoke detector, the old baby monitor repurposed and tucked onto a shelf. And my heart raced as I realized how little privacy there had ever been in this house, how every movement, every word could have been observed. And he said they couldn't hear us right now. Not if we stayed here, not if we kept our voices low, because this room was the only one without audio, the only blind spot. And that was why he had brought me here, why he had insisted we sit on the floor instead of the couch, and the carefulness of it all made my skin prickle. And I asked him how long we had before they noticed something was wrong. And he shrugged, saying it depended on how bored they got, how often they checked, but that sometimes they watched just to feel in control. And that word lodged itself in my chest, control, because suddenly everything made sense. The accident, the surveillance, the threats. It wasn't just about money or convenience. It was about power, about ensuring silence, about shaping the narrative. And as my thoughts raced, I realized I couldn't confront them. Not yet, not without proof, not without a plan. Because confronting people who believed they were untouchable was how people ended up dead. And the boy seemed to read that realization on my face, because he leaned closer and told me he had proof, real proof. Pulse thundered things as I asked him what kind of proof. And he told me about the phone his father kept hidden in the locked bedroom, the one he used only at night, the one with messages and recordings and pictures, the one his mother thought was destroyed after the accident. And my mind raced through the implications, through the risks, and I asked him how he knew what was on it. And he told me he had watched his father unlock it dozens of times, had memorized the pattern without even trying. Because when you are quiet, people forget you are watching. And a chill ran through me at the truth of that, at how invisibility had become both his prison and his shield. And before I could talk myself out of it, before fear could override logic, I asked him where the phone was, and he stood, his movements careful, practiced, and gestured for me to follow. And every step down the hallway felt like walking deeper into a nightmare I had never wanted to acknowledge. And as we reached the locked door, he hesitated, his hand hovering near the handle. And I saw the fear surge back, raw and powerful. And I knelt beside him, meeting his eyes, telling him we could stop, that he didn't have to do this. And he shook his head, determination settling over his features like armor. And he said if we didn't do it now, there might not be another chance. And with that, he unlocked the door, slipped inside, and guided me through a room that felt frozen in time, heavy with secrets. And he went straight to the drawer beside the bed, pulling out the phone wrapped in an old sock. And when he placed it in my hands, it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every lie that had been told. And my fingers trembled as I turned it on, half expecting an alarm, a notification, something to betray us. But the screen lit silently. And when I unlocked it using the pattern he described, my stomach lurched, because there it was, message threads filled, horrifyingly clear, calendar entries marking dates that aligned too perfectly with my accident, audio files labeled with innocuous names that, when I played one softly, revealed my brother's voice discussing timing, risk, and outcomes in a tone I barely recognized. And tears blurred my vision as the reality solidified, as denial became impossible. And through it all, the boy stood beside me, steady, watching my face, and I realized he had already processed this truth long, before I ever had been living with it alone. And when I looked at him again, I saw not just a child, but a survivor, and that realization hardened something inside me, something resolute, because whatever fears still lingered, it was now outweighed by a fierce need to protect him, to expose the truth. And as I carefully turned the phone off and hid it beneath my jacket, my mind already racing through next steps, legal options, safe places, I felt a sudden vibration against my hip, my own phone lighting up with a notification. And when I saw my brother's name on the screen, A chill ran down my spine because the message was short, deceptively casual, asking if everything was okay, saying they were just checking in. And in that moment, I understood how close the walls were, how quickly this could turn dangerous. And as I typed a calm, reassuring response with shaking fingers, I knew the game had begun, that from this point on, every move mattered. And as I sent the message and slipped my phone away, I met the boy's gaze once more, and in his eyes I saw not fear now, but trust, and that trust settled over me like a vow, because whatever it took, however long it took, I would make sure his voice, once finally heard, would never be silenced again. I barely slept that night, not because I was afraid of the dark house or the cameras, or even my brother's sudden check-in message, but because every time I closed my eyes, I heard the boy's voice again, replayed the audio files I had listened to just enough to confirm the truth without fully absorbing the horror of them. And when morning finally came, it felt like stepping onto a stage where the script could no longer be changed, only performed carefully enough to survive. And I went through the motions of breakfast, packing his lunch, responding to my brother's texts with cheerful updates, while inside I was mapping exits, allies, timelines, and consequences, and the boy watched me quietly, understanding far more than he let on. And when we were finally alone again in that blind spot room, he told me there was one more thing I needed to know, something he hadn't said before because he wasn't sure I'd believe him, and my chest tightened as I told him he could tell me anything. And he said the tea wasn't the first plan, that it was only the easiest, the quietest, because his father hated messes, hated unpredictability, and preferred things that looked like accidents or medical issues. And he told me about other conversations he had overheard about pills crushed in a food, about dosages, about waiting for the right moment when stress or fatigue could be blamed. And I felt sick as I realized how methodical it all was, how patient, and how close I had already come without knowing. And when I asked him why now, why tell me this time, he said because they were leaving for longer than usual, because they were too confident, and because he was tired of being afraid all the time, tired of pretending he couldn't speak when words were screaming inside him. And that broke something open in me, because I understood then that saving my life wasn't the only thing he was trying to do. He was trying to reclaim his own, and that realization sharpened my resolve into something unshakable. And over the next hours, we planned quietly, carefully agreeing on what to say, what not to say, when to act, and when to wait. And I contacted someone I trusted, someone who knew my brother only in passing, framing my message in vague concerns and asking for help without revealing everything yet. And when they responded almost immediately, agreeing to come by later under the pretense of checking on me after my accident, I felt the first flicker of hope, fragile but real. And when my brother called that evening, video this time, I forced myself to smile into the camera, to joke, to complain lightly about work, to praise his son's good behavior. And the boy played his part perfectly, sitting beside me, silent, eyes downcast, exactly as they expected. And I watched my brother's face carefully for any sign of suspicion, any crack in a mask, but he only smiled, satisfied, and ended the call with a reminder about the tea, joking that it was good for my nerves. And when the screen went dark, my hand shook so badly I had to sit down. And the boy reached for me again, grounding me with that same calm presence. And later, when my trusted friend arrived, I showed them the phone, the messages, the recordings, and watched their expression change from concern to disbelief to grim certainty. And together we decided the next steps had to be immediate but discreet, that authorities needed to be involved, but only after the boy was safe, after we ensured he wouldn't be sent back into that house without protection, and arrangements were made quietly, documents copied, evidence backed up, and contingency plans set in place. And through it all, the boy stayed close, occasionally speaking in short, soft sentences when he felt safe enough, each word a small act of rebellion. And when the time finally came to make the call, to report everything, My heart pounded with the knowledge that there was no going back, that whatever happened next would fracture the family forever. But as I looked at him, standing a little straighter now, a little freer, I knew the fracture had already exposing the fault line, and the aftermath was exactly as chaotic as I feared: questions, disbelief, anger, my brother's shocked denial, his wife's cold silence. But there was also validation, protection, and consequences, and when they were finally confronted with the evidence, with their own words played back to them, there was a moment where my brother looked at me not with rage, but with something like regret, and I realized then that whatever bond we once had was truly gone, and strangely, that didn't hurt as much as I expected, because in its place was something stronger, something cleaner. And weeks later, when the house was quiet again, not with fear, but with peace, the boy sat beside me and spoke freely, telling me about school, about things he liked, about how strange it felt to use his voice without punishment, and I listened. Every word a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. And sometimes I think back to that moment at the door, the tea cooling in my hand, his voice cutting through the silence. And I know with absolute certainty that if he hadn't spoken when he did, I wouldn't be here, and neither would the person I am now. Because surviving something like that doesn't just save your life, it changes how you value it, and how fiercely you protect those who find the courage to speak when silence is all they've ever known.